2024 will be known as the year that the vintage synthesizer market crashed. Now, for those of us who have spent an ungodly amount on vintage synthesizers over the past couple of years, that's terrible news, because we're not going to be able to sell our vintage synths and get our money back, at least for a little bit. But you, on the other hand, can take advantage of this situation and buy a vintage synthesizer at a record low price since the great synthflation of 2020. Take the Roland Juno 106, the most popular vintage synthesizer sold on Reverb, as an example. Just a little bit more than a year and a half ago, a mint Juno 106 sold for as much as $4,300. Compare that to earlier this year, where a mint Juno 106 sold for $1,500. That is an incredible amount of depreciation in about a year's time. So if you've been thinking about buying a vintage synthesizer, now is your time to strike. Hi, I'm Vulture Culture, and this video will be an exhaustive guide on which vintage synthesizer is the right buy for you in 2024. Now, because everybody is different, I've broken this video up into a bunch of chapters that you can easily jump to down below. Each chapter will give you what I consider to be the best vintage synth alternatives to legendary synthesizers like the Roland Jupiter 8, Yamaha CS-80, Minimoog, Prophet 5, Oberheim OB-X, PPG Wave, and many, many more. And every single synthesizer in this video costs less than $2,000 on Reverb, and that's including shipping. Well, except for my last one, which is my Desert Island vintage synthesizer. But first, let's start with the Uli Killers, the absolute best bang for your buck vintage synthesizers that you can buy in 2024. All four of these synths cost less than $400 with shipping, aka the cost of a Behringer Pro-800, which many people consider to be the best value synthesizer ever brought to market. The absolute best value vintage digital synthesizer you can buy is the Kawai K1 for a staggeringly cheap $260 with shipping. The Kawai K1 was released in 1988 to go head-to-head with Roland's D-50 LA synthesizer, and you can tell because every voice has 4 oscillators just like a D-50. Each one of those oscillators can be one of 256 different waveforms, which are both single-cycle waves as well as short samples and even drum samples. You've got 16 notes of polyphony, you have velocity and aftertouch, but most importantly, you have one of my favorite sounding synths of the 80s. I'm sure in 88, this synthesizer did not seem to be as fully featured as a Korg M1 or a D-50. But as a modern user looking back, the grainy, gritty character of those low-fidelity samples sounds so freaking good. Everything sounds like it came out of a PS2 game. It has this wonderful vintage digital character that I am obsessed with. Choir sounds are chef's kiss amazing. It's not the most versatile synth. It's not going to do all of the different types of sounds you might want it to, but it is an incredible digital synthesizer, and at $260, it is a complete no-brainer. You've got plenty of great string sounds, haunting pads, you have FM bass sounds, you've got ring modulation built into this. I mean, comparing the synthesizer to a modern digital synth, it's crazy the value. So if you are like me and you love vintage digital synthesizers, this might be the greatest bargain of all time. Next up, we have the absolute best value vintage analog mono synth of 2024, which is the Yamaha CS-01 for only $350. I cannot tell you what a crazy deal this is, because the Yamaha CS series commands the highest prices of any vintage synthesizer on the market, the CS-80. The Yamaha CS-01, although it might look like a toy, actually has the same oscillators in it as the big bad vintage Yamaha Polys. And so it has that Vangelis Blade Runner sound in it. You've only got one oscillator, you've only got one filter. I mean, it's a very simple synthesizer, but that's also kind of its strength. It's super simple to use and it just sounds incredible. The VCO is actually very flexible. You've got triangle, saw, square, pulse, and PWM, as well as mixable noise. And you have that characteristic 12 decibel per octave CS-80 style filter. And you even have glissando, which is like portamento, but where it steps through every note. That's a feature on the CS-80 that you see on almost no other synthesizers. You got cute little mod wheels there. I mean, it's actually a very, very smartly laid out synthesizer. And for $350, to be able to get that Blade Runner sound at that price point, I mean, this is the easiest vintage synthesizer to ever recommend. And again, for less than the cost of a Behringer Pro-800. I mean, how cool is that to have this piece of history from 1982 that's super simple and fun to use and sounds incredible? Well, what if I want a vintage analog synth where I can play more than one note at a time? Well, that brings us to the criminally underrated Korg Poly 800 for $364. Now you've got 8 voices of polyphony, or 4 if you use it in double mode, which I recommend so you can get that wonderful detuning between the oscillators. Let's get the elephant in the room out of the way. The Poly 800 is a paraphonic synth, not a polyphonic synth. Paraphonic means all of the oscillators share one filter, instead of on other polyphonic synthesizers where each voice has its own filter. Now, a lot of people think that's a total deal breaker, but actually the first time I got a Poly 800, I was shocked at how much the paraphony didn't matter 95% of the time. I mean, think about it. If you're doing a bass line, it's usually monophonic. If you're playing a lead, usually monophonic. If you're playing strings, organ sounds, stuff like that, it's usually you play all the keys at once. The only time that paraphonic filter really comes into play is if you have a wide sweep of the filter, like some brass sounds. But even then, it just sort of sounds like you have a polyphonic synth in legato mode, where holding down a note, you can play other notes, but the filter's like getting darker. Now, it has a few tricks up its sleeve. Like, for instance, each voice has its own amplifier, even though it shares one filter, and the noise shares the same envelope as the filter as well. So what that means is that you can use the filter's envelope to control the level of the noise, unlike on most synthesizers where you're just blending the noise in amount, like as part of the oscillator mix that gets fed into the filter. On the Poly 800, you can actually control that, and because you have these complex envelopes, 6-stage envelopes per voice, even when they're doubled up, you can sort of create like a 2-stage wave sequence type sound. So there's actually quite a lot of complexity you can get out of the Poly 800, much more than people realize on first blush. And let's not forget the incredible analog chorus that this synthesizer has. It is so Juno-esque and thick. The Poly 800 shares the same NJM 2069 filter chip as the DW8000, which is one of my favorite filter sounds of all time. Seriously, it is the best filter chip that Korg ever made. The only thing that holds this synth back from being world-class is that the oscillator chips don't sound quite as fat as something like the Mono Poly or Korg Poly 6. You can check out the live stream that I've done on the Poly 800 by hitting the annotation above right here. Next up, we have the greatest vintage synthesizer of 2024. Unlike the first 3 synths on this list, which all have a little bit of an Achilles heel, this is a no throat clearing, awesome synthesizer that I would be happy with as my desert island synth till the end of time. It is a fully featured vintage synthesizer that sounds incredible, and it is none other than the Korg DW6000. $370. Hallelujah. Now, the sound demo you're going to hear is from my DW8000 back there, which is a variant on the 6000 that came out the same year. The only differences are the 6000 has less waveforms than the 8000, but it does have the best waveforms. And And it also doesn't have velocity or aftertouch, but a positive of the 6000 is it actually has an analog chorus built in, whereas the chorus delay on the DW8000 is digital. So here's how it sounds. Okay, let's start with what might be the most iconic vintage synthesizer of all time, the Roland Jupiter 8. The Jupiter 8, released in 1981, was used on countless hit songs like Michael Jackson's Thriller, most of Duran Duran's music, and soundtracks like the theme to Miami Vice or Knight Rider. As such, it's one of the most expensive synthesizers in the world, routinely commanding prices of over $20,000. Now, what if I told you that there is a vintage synthesizer for less than $1,000, made by Roland themselves, with almost an identical architecture, and in fact uses the exact same filter chip, the IR3109 filter chip, as the Roland Jupiter 8. That synthesizer is the Roland JX3P, which you can get right now for $850. The JX3P has two digitally controlled analog oscillators per voice, unlike the Juno 106, which only has one plus a sub-oscillator. And so you're going to get a lot closer to that Jupiter 8 detuned sound than you will with something like a Juno 106 with the JX3P. And while we're on the topic of DCOs, let's just break that down for a second. Just because it has the word digital in the name does not mean it is a digital oscillator. That's a misconception. What it means is that the tuning of the oscillator is digitally controlled. The way DCOs work is they either take a high-frequency analog oscillator or a high-frequency digital clock and divide that down to get each separate voice. The end result being a very stable analog oscillator, which in 1983 was seen as such an improvement over the wildly unstable VCOs of the previous generation. Nowadays, in our nice climate-controlled studios, we love the sound of VCOs because there's a little bit more depth and movement to them. But in the 80s, you did not want to take a VCO synth on stage because that thing's going to heat up. There's all sorts of variables. If it gets knocked a little bit, it could get knocked out of tune. And DCOs were seen as the future. And they do sound really great, and they certainly can sound extremely fat on the JX3P. The JX3P certainly has one of the warmest sounds of all of the Roland synthesizers. And the reason is because even though it has that same IR3109 filter chip, it can't push into full oscillation the way the Jupiter 8 does. So it's a little bit more of a mellow sound. Definitely got that Roland signature. And so if you love those types of sounds, it's actually shocking how close you can get a Jupiter 8 to sound to a JX3P. And unlike a Jupiter 8, it actually has a really great analog chorus like the Juno 106. It's my favorite analog chorus of all time. It's got a 128-step sequencer on it. Of course, if you want to program it, the easiest way to do it is with either a PG-200 or a retroactive programmer. But you can program it from the panel. It's not difficult at all. It has built-in MIDI. It doesn't have velocity or aftertouch, but one of the things to keep in mind when you're thinking about legendary analog tones, almost all of the vintage synthesizers we consider legendary nowadays did not have velocity or aftertouch. Jupiter 8, no velocity or aftertouch. Prophet 5, no velocity or aftertouch. Oberheim OB-X, XA, or 8, no velocity or aftertouch. So if you want to get those types of sounds, you don't really want to be using a lot of velocity and aftertouch anyways. And something like the JX3P is an incredible bargain buy to get, maybe one of the best value vintage analog synthesizers of all time. If you're looking for that vintage Roland analog polysynth sound, in my opinion, there is no better option than the JX3P. Now there is a rack mount version of the synthesizer, the MKS30, and it does respond to velocity over MIDI, so if you want a little bit more expression, that might be the way you want to go. To keep a level playing field for this list, I decided not to count rack mount synthesizers unless they are absolutely the only version of the synthesizer there is, just because rack mounts tend to be cheaper because they have less components. But I do want you to know that there are often rack mount versions of many of the synths on this list that you can get for even cheaper than the full keybed versions. So that's a great way to get a bargain on a vintage synth, especially if you're tight on space or you just care about the sound and you don't mind using a master MIDI controller. In this case, the MKS30 was actually $100 more than the JX3P, but most of the time you will find that rack mount synths are cheaper. Next up, can you hear it coming in the air tonight? It is the best vintage alternative to the Sequential Circuits Prophet 5. The Prophet 5 came out in 1977, and it is no exaggeration to say it is the most revolutionary synthesizer of all time. The Prophet 5, designed by Dave Smith and John Bowen, was the first synthesizer to use a microprocessor, which allowed the synthesizer to be fully programmable and patches to be fully recallable. This meant musicians could take this synthesizer on stage with them, change patches in between or even during songs without having to reprogram any of the knobs and faders on the front panel. But even more importantly, the sound of the Prophet 5 is the essential analog polyphonic synth sound. It is the sound by which every synthesizer is judged, and so many synthesizers have strove to emulate. Now, most years, the sequential 6-track would probably be my first port of call for emulating that Prophet 5 sound. However, this year, the 6-track has pretty much held its value at $1,175 from my homies over at Synth City in Chicago, which when you consider you can get a legally modified Prophet 600 for $1,250, it makes it so clear that the Prophet 600 is the ideal vintage alternative to the coveted Prophet 5. So the Prophet 600 is a great example of the great synth deflation. These synthesizers were going for at least $2,000 not very long ago, and now there are many of them going for prices like $1,250, which is insane. What you get in terms of features with the Prophet 600 is unparalleled with any vintage synthesizer under $2,000. Both the Prophet 600 and the Prophet 5 Rev 3, which was the last revision of the original Prophet 5s, share the same Curtis Electro Music 3340 VCOs. So essentially the starting point is exactly the same. Then they both go through similar Curtis filter chips, so the raw sound should be pretty close to match to a Prophet 5 Rev 3. Now, a vanilla Prophet 600 has a couple of issues, one of them being slow, unresponsive digital envelopes, and then also the filter has a tendency to step through the digital values because it's digitally controlled. So it's an analog filter, but you'll hear those discrete steps as you turn the knob. Gleegly came and created a mod for the Prophet 600 that fixes all of this stuff. So when you're buying a Prophet 600, you should get one that either has the Gleegly mod already installed installed, or get the Gleegly mod and install it yourself if you feel comfortable with that type of thing. Some people prefer the original sound, but most people tend to be in the camp of liking the added features of the Gleegly mod. It also adds like other LFO shapes and things like that. That to me is not as exciting, just as fixing some of those core issues that were there. And the Prophet 600 that I showed you is Gleegly modded for $12.50, and there's other ones out there modded at similar prices. It's crazy what a value that is, because there's no other synthesizer on this list under $2,000 that has 2 voltage controlled oscillators per voice, and certainly not ones with the heritage of the 3340s. The 3340s were used in plenty of other legendary synthesizers like the Oberheim OB-X. It just is one of the most revered VCOs of all time. The Prophet 600 was actually one of the first synths with MIDI. Dave Smith contributed to inventing MIDI, which is without a doubt one of the most important inventions in music technology history. And he demoed it at NAMM by hooking it up to a Roland Jupiter 6 and being able to play the Jupiter 6 from the Prophet 600 and vice versa. I did a poll a while back on my channel asking you guys if you would prefer a $1,200 vintage synthesizer or a $400 Behringer clone, and 55% of you guys said you actually would prefer the vintage synthesizer, which I thought was super fascinating. And what was also fascinating is I got a bunch of comments of people saying things like, well, usually vintage synths cost 10 times as much as the Behringer clones. But this is the perfect case in point that that's not always true. The Prophet 800 is literally a clone of the Prophet 600, and it costs about a third of the Prophet 600. So if you're worried about your vintage synth purchase maintaining its value, I think this is a pretty clear indicator that most people, most of the time, would prefer to have that vintage hardware over a modern clone. Just food for thought. Next up, we have the best alternatives to the most legendary synthesizer of all time, the mighty Yamaha CS-80. The CS-80 is one of the rarest synthesizers in the world, and because it was used so famously by Vangelis on the Blade Runner soundtrack, it is the most expensive synthesizer on this list, clocking in at $64,000. There's only one for sale in the world right now, so if you want to get it, that's what it costs. But luckily, there are some really great alternatives that cost 1/64th that amount or less. But before we get to the alternatives, I'd really appreciate it if you'd subscribe to the channel. I know you guys are tired of hearing it from YouTubers. I am too, but that algorithm fucking sucks, and I really need your help to be able to keep creating content here on YouTube. So if you can, just please hit that subscribe button. It makes a huge difference. So first off, I want you guys to hear the CS-70M, which is the nearest relative to the CS-80 in the Yamaha analog synth family. That way you can familiarize yourself with the CS sound. Actually, the best budget way I can think of getting that Vangelis Blade Runner sound is actually the Yamaha CS-15D, which you can get for only $700. What's super cool about the CS-15D is that it's essentially one preset voice of the CS-70M. That synthesizer says dual channel polyphonic synthesizer, and you can see this 15D actually looks pretty similar to the CS-70M, and it just says dual channel synthesizer. And so you've got a bunch of presets. You can't do too much tweaking with them, but it's a lot of the sounds that you would use anyways, and it's using the multi-mode filter from the CS-70M. So it's got that bandpass in there, so you have all sorts of different timbres, but then you can mix different presets and get all sorts of different sounds. So you can't play polyphonically, but if you're looking for that Blade Runner brass lead sound, you could get a lot of mileage out of this synth, as well as getting all sorts of other cool sounds that have that unique 12 decibel per octave filter character to them. So the CS-15D is definitely the most budget way to get into the world of vintage Yamaha analog synthesizers. Next up, we have the CS-15, so no D in this one, and that comes in at just under $1,000. The blackface monophonic CS synths came out the same year as the iconic CS-50, 60, and 80. But they're only monophonic, and in the case of the CS-15 and 30, I believe they're duophonic if you use CV and gate. But they share the same high-pass, bandpass, and low-pass filters of the CS-80 and the like. And there's a lot of depth there. There's sample and hold, all sorts of nittier, grittier stuff that you can get going with the synthesizer. So if you're not content with the presets of the CS-15D, the 15 will give you a lot more nitty-gritty that you synthesists can dig your teeth into. It is a mono synth, but it's very flexible at that, and I just think that this is a very good way to get into that Yamaha CS thing if you can't afford a big polyphonic CS synthesizer. And that leads us to our next synth. The trouble with the Yamaha analog synths is they didn't make many polyphonic ones, and the ones that they did make are all very, very expensive. However, this is where I'll bring up actually the earlier generation of analog synth technology, the string machine. Yamaha made a few different of these, and these are called the SK series of their synths. And I think the sweet spot for this is the Yamaha SK20, which you can get for $1,100. Now, the strings and polysynth and everything is paraphonic, so it's kind of like the Poly 800 where everything's going to share that single filter. But again, sort of like the argument I made there, if you want to go for those Blade Runner string sounds, you want to go for that Blade Runner brass lead sound, you don't really need a polyphonic filter. I actually think the Yamaha string machines are probably the best way for someone to get that Blade Runner sound because they can play polyphonically but not break the bank. At $1,100, it's not the cheapest string machine you could get, but I think it's actually a very characterful, warm, beautiful sound that gives you that instant tears and rain feeling. Some fun facts, the organ section of the synthesizer is actually FM synthesis. It was early FM created by Yamaha that would eventually be released in the DX7, was first tried out in this SK series of synths just for the organ section. The polysynth section in the 20, which you don't get in any of the lower level SK synths, is 7 notes, and it doesn't have a very fast envelope, so you're not going to get like really great percussive plucky sounds out of it, but you can get some really awesome string sounds. I think the crowning jewel of it is the ensemble effect, which is also in the CS-70M, but essentially what that is it takes 3 bucket brigade delays and it smears them all together to get that warm, awesome Blade Runner string sound that I just love. It's very VP330 Roland sort of a sound. And yeah, I just think that this is a very compelling synth for any Blade Runner aficionado. Next up, let's talk about the most popularly sold vintage synthesizer on Reverb, the Juno 106. I know when I say the word vintage synthesizer, the image of the Roland Juno 106 pops up in your head. So even though the 106's price has fallen dramatically the past year, there's actually 3 synthesizers that I would rather have that are cheaper than $1,500. All of these synths share the same basic architecture. That is, a single oscillator plus a sub ran through some chorus to thicken it up. Without a doubt, the best way to get that Roland Juno sound on a budget is the Roland Alpha Juno II, or as I like to call it, the Roland Juno Tokyo Drift. Now, some of you might be thinking that the Alpha Juno 1, which is like the cut down version that has less keys and it doesn't have velocity or aftertouch, would be the best budget option. But for whatever reason, right now in the market, the Alpha 2 is actually $100 cheaper than the Alpha 1. And in my opinion, the Alpha 2 is superior in every way to the Juno 106, except for the fact that it doesn't have a fully resonant filter. And how many of you guys actually need that filter to be fully resonant that often? The Alpha Junos came out the year after the Juno 106, and they featured many more waveforms than the Juno 106 can do. You've also got a variable control over the chorus that you don't have on the 106. You've got 6-stage envelopes instead of just 4. And most famously, you have saw width mod, or the ability to adjust the pulse width of the sawtooth wave, not just the square waves, to get those famous Hoover sounds. Obviously, the reason people don't like the Alpha Junos is because it doesn't have the hands-on control of the Juno 106. But in terms of the actual sound, I think it sounds maybe even better. At the time, the IR3R05 chip, which is the sort of replacement to the 3109 style chip that Roland was putting in their Juno and Jupiter synths, was considered a downgrade. But what's interesting is I've actually polled you guys on which of the JX synths you would prefer, and counterintuitively is actually the JX8P that most people voted for, which has the same filter chip as the Alpha Juno series. So people think that is the best sounding JX synth, but for some reason when it comes to the Junos, it's considered the worst. And remember, the JX3P has the same filter as the Jupiter 8, so riddle me that one. The Alpha Juno 2 also has velocity and aftertouch, which is not present on the 660 106 or Alpha Juno 1. And at $550, it's just an incredible bargain to get a synthesizer that can sound like a Juno 106, but also has these very bright waveforms that can kind of put it into DX7 adjacent territory. It's just one of the most clean, powerful, in-your-face, brassy sounding synthesizers I've ever played. Next up, we have a real underdog, the Akai AX60, one of my favorite synthesizers, and you can get one of these bad boys for $870 right now. This is another synth that used to command much higher prices a couple of years ago, and for whatever reason has fallen through the synth snob cracks. One major upgrade that the Akai AX60 has over something like the Alpha Juno is it has voltage-controlled oscillators instead of digitally controlled ones. So there's more movement to the sound. It's a little bit more alive and organic sounding. It has saw width mod, like the Alpha Juno, although it doesn't sound the same. And one of my gripes about the synth is the variable pulse width on different waveforms doesn't always work. I think it sounds best on the square wave or the saw and triangle together. So that's a little bit of a downer, but the real treasure of the synthesizer is they made a mistake when they made it and overloaded the resonance, and that in combination with the filter FM can get you some of the gnarliest, ungodly, gorgeous, distorted, ripping synth tones I've ever heard. So what's fascinating about this synth is it can go really warm and creamy, analog sounding, pretty dark, honestly, all the way into gnarly territory. It's just so cool, so unique. Nothing else sounds like an Akai AX60. I just think it's one of my favorite synthesizers just because it is so unique. Next up, we have one of my all-time favorite synthesizers. This is the Juno 106, but you want it to sound better than a Juno 106, the Korg Poly 6, which you can get right now for a mind-blowing $1,250. Okay, so what makes the Poly 6 sound so good is we have SSM filters, which were not used in most of the synths in this list, but they were used in legendary synths like the Prophet 5 Rev 1 and 2, as well as the PPG Wave. So we have SSM filters in the Poly 6. We also have an incredible effects section. We have a gorgeous sounding chorus, phaser, and ensemble. So that's using 3 bucket brigade delays. So you can kind of get those vintage string machine sounds out of it, but of course it's still polyphonic. The chorus sounds incredible. The phaser is so unique sounding, and there's just a wilderness to the oscillators. These things go in and out of tune, but it's always musical and great. I adore the Poly 6. It's probably my second desert island synth. It's not quite the one at the end of this video, but I would say anybody would be lucky to have even one synth as incredible sounding as the Poly 6. I think of it as the anti-VST synth. It is the synth that sounds the furthest from a VST imaginable. If I want to get that sound that I just don't think I can get in the box, it's just so warm, gooey, wild. The arpeggiator is really unique because it can step all the way up through as many octaves as the synth can do, as opposed to most ARPs that just do like 1 or 2 octaves. It's just a true treasure of a synthesizer, and for $1,250, I encourage you to get one of these now before they go back up in value. One thing you absolutely have to know about the Poly 6 before you consider buying one is to ask the seller or see in the description if the battery has been removed, because Korg had this brilliant idea, which was, why don't we put a rechargeable battery in our synths so you'll never lose your patches? It's a great idea. The problem is a rechargeable battery, if the synth isn't turned on, it doesn't charge, and eventually the battery will rupture and leak battery acid all over the motherboard. So many Poly 6s have died because of this. So before you buy one, you need to make sure that the problem's been addressed, because there's very few Poly 6s out there that are still alive that have the original battery installed. If somehow you're looking at purchasing a Poly 6 with the original original battery, it needs to be the top priority of yours to get it to a qualified synth technician and replace that battery with a switchable one. Not trying to scare you, but just be aware that that is a common issue with the Poly 6 and just want to make sure that you've got that handled before you purchase one. Next up, let's talk about the best alternatives for the Moog Minimoog that was originally produced from 1970 to 1981. The Minimoog is undoubtedly the most famous synthesizer sound ever. 3 VCOs fed through the ladder filter, which is Bob Moog's design. And Moog synths have always stood for quality and for sonic superiority. And so let's look at some really great alternatives to the Minimoog that don't cost an arm and a leg. Now, the best budget way to actually get that Moog ladder filter sound is the MG1, or the Realistic Concert Mate. The MG1 fascinates me because it was actually a collaboration between Moog and Radio Shack. It's the most widely owned vintage Moog because they made so many of them at a price of $500 back then. And there's a lot of stuff you don't get with an MG1 that you have on a Mini Moog. You don't have pitch and mod wheels, for instance. You've only got 2 oscillators instead of 3. Although you have a polyphonic square wave oscillator you can mix in as well. It's got digital pseudo noise instead of analog noise. So what that is it's a short sample of noise that loops, and as soon as you notice it, you can't unhear that loop. My Moog Source has it too, and it's just a kind of a thing that isn't quite as good as having a full analog Moog, but overall, pretty impressive what you get at a $550 price point. Next up, do we have any twisted fire starters out there? It is the Moog Prodigy for $1420. Prodigy is very similar to a Mini Moog in terms of architecture. You get all of the hands-on control that is missing from the Moog Source. You don't get quite everything you get with a Source, but it's quite a bit cheaper. For those of you who don't know, the Source is basically the digital update to the Mini Moog, so it's like the same components as a Mini Moog, but inside this Miami Vice casing. People really don't like that there aren't knobs on the Source, so even though it costs more money, I think a lot of people would prefer to have the Prodigy because you do have that hands-on control. Sure, it doesn't have everything that a Mini Moog can do, but it's so much cheaper. And as Starsky Carr said, everything is a sweet spot with the synthesizer. So if I was in the market for a vintage Moog, the Prodigy would probably be the one that I would be looking at right now. I've got one more synthesizer that might catch you off guard. It's the Roland SH-2. You could get an SH-2 for $1,750 right now. So recently I did a live stream shooting out the SH-2 versus the Moog source, and what I found was the filters sound virtually identical. The oscillators on the SH-2 are slightly brighter than the Moog source, which again is essentially the same thing as a mini Moog, but just in a different casing. But where the SH-2 really shined is in the comparison of the bass lines, because the SH-2 has a trick up its sleeve. It can do pulse width modulation, and mini Moogs and Prodigies and realistic concert mates can't. So even though it's like 98% as thick as the source, I think it's still the better option. It's just a very characterful synth that sounds really phenomenal. It has a very unique bright character because of the ladder filter, which loses some of the low end when you crank the resonance. It's just a gorgeous sounding synth, and it has the hands-on control and a few tricks up its sleeve that you don't get from any of the Moogs. I just think it's a really captivating synth. So I just wanted to demonstrate that here. The SH-2 is a really phenomenal sounding synthesizer. And for me, after I did the comparison between the SH-2 and the source, I decided I no longer needed the source because I pretty much had that Moog sound covered by the SH-2. Yeah, that's sort of a curveball for if you want to get the Moog sound. You don't necessarily need to get it from the Moog company itself. The SH-2 is slightly rougher around the edges, a little bit more of a grainy character, but I like that it sounds sort of unique. But I understand for some of you Moog heads, nothing without that Moog name on the synthesizer will do, in which case I would probably go with a Prodigy. Sweet dreams are made of Oberheim synths, and we have come to one of the most iconic brands in all of analog synthesis. The Oberheim OB-X and OB-XA were used by bands like Prince, Rush, Eurythmics, Queen, so many others from the 80s. And the sound of those Oberheim polysynths is so incredibly massive. The detune, everything is so creamy, and when you crank the resonance, you don't lose any bass, and you get that wonderful filter snarl. If there's one brand that's associated with growling analog filters, it's certainly Oberheim. So what's the best way to get that vintage Oberheim analog sound on a budget? So the most value vintage Oberheim synthesizer you can get is actually a Matrix 1000 for $745. The Matrix 1000 is a slightly slimmed down rack mount version of the Matrix 6R, which in turn is the rack mount version of the Matrix 6, which came out in 1985. The Matrix 6 is by far one of the best value bang for your buck 2 DCO per voice analog synths you can get. I think it sounds the best out of any that I've heard as far as DCO synths go. And what's so great about the Matrix 1000 is although you can't edit the synth from the panel, you have 1000 presets. So someone's come up with that Oberheim sound you're looking for, that exact sound, and it's on there. And you can program it using a software editor or even something like a hardware programmer. But the average user is just going to pull up one of those presets. If you want to get the full keyboard editable version, the Matrix 6 is the next step up, and those go for $1,425 right now, which is a steal. Like I said, I think it's the best sounding 2 DCO per voice synth you can get. I've got it right here behind me. The Matrix series was definitely Oberheim's attempt to push things forward. We actually use the phrase modulation matrix because of the Matrix series. So the depth of modulation that you can achieve with any of the matrix synthesizers is a lot deeper than you can get from any of the OB synthesizers. It's all sorts of stuff like ramp generators and things like that that aren't available on the OB series. And so in that sense, they're actually more powerful synthesizers than the OBs. They have velocity and aftertouch, which none of the OBs have. The two reasons, and this is a theme you're going to see again and again here, that these aren't commanding prices like an OB-X is just that it doesn't have the front panel controls of the OB-X, and it has DCOs instead of VCOs. And that means a lot to the vintage synth snobs out there. I've actually found it not very difficult to program this synthesizer directly from the front panel, but it is a little bit of a chore because you have to enter the parameter numbers and everything. So it's an investment of time into learning the synthesizer and also programming the synthesizer. So if you just want really great Oberheim sounds, I definitely go Matrix 1000. And if you want to program your own Oberheim sounds, then I would definitely go with the Matrix 6. I'm working on creating a tutorial for programming the Matrix 6, so if you want to check that out, I'll put the annotation above. It's not out yet, so until then, I'll just put a link to the live stream I did on the Matrix 6 so you can hear more about how it sounds and more facts about it. Next up, let's talk about the most famous wavetable hybrid synthesizer of all time, the PPG Wave, and its cheaper alternatives. Right now, you can get a PPG Wave for just about $15,000, which is a triumphant amount of money. But hybrid synths happen to be my favorite category of synthesizer, and I've got a bunch to show you that are very reasonable in price. What is almost always the best value vintage hybrid synthesizer you can buy is the Korg DW8000, which you can get right now for a mere $680. This synth sounds so freaking good. It is one of my favorite vintage synthesizer sounds of all time. It sounds really analog, if you want to call it that. It's like darker than something like the Korg Poly 6, for instance. That NJM 2069 filter is so deep. If you want to make a bass sound, it is earth-shattering. And that's what we're looking for from a lot of vintage analog synths, right? Is for it to have that warm, fat sound. The DW8000 is easily the darkest sounding synth that I have in terms of tonal brightness. It is just so fat, and those wavetables sound so glassy and beautiful. Unlike some other hybrids that really fall apart in the low end, the DW8000 is pretty clean all the way down. You get a little bit of that vintage digital gritty color. It really retains its integrity all the way down, so you can get incredible bass notes, all sorts of modulation possibilities. It's got velocity and aftertouch. It's also got a double chorus delay, so you can get stereo chorus delay effects. It's just an impeccably great synth. I already talked about its little cousin, the DW6000, which is also incredible, but the DW8000 is my pick for best value hybrid synthesizer you can get. Next up, the Ensoniq ESQ1 is almost always one of the most affordable vintage hybrids, but right now you can get an ESQ1 for $600, but you can get an SQ80 for $700, which I think is a much better bargain. So the SQ80 is like the ESQ1, but it has velocity and polyphonic aftertouch. And $700, it is such a steal. This particular one is being sold by my friend Dubstation Zero. The SQ80's Curtis filter chip is one of the best implemented filters I've ever heard. It really has that Oberheim growl, but you have all of the advantages of hybrid synthesis. The SQ80, unlike the DW8000 or ESQ1, really starts to feel more like a D-50 in terms of layering actual samples with synthesis as opposed to just single cycle waves. The real advantage of the SQ80 is that you can run those samples through analog filters, which you can't do on an M1. The M1 doesn't even have fully resonant filters, and the D-50 can't run its samples through the filters, only sawtooth and square waves. So the SQ80 has a true advantage there. And then of course, polyphonic aftertouch. I mean, this is the only synthesizer on this list that has polyphonic aftertouch natively. It's just an incredible sounding synth. Many people say that the SQ80 was actually the first workstation before the M1 started the workstation revolution. And that's because the sequencer is so powerful. You also have multiple amplifiers, which means when you stack the synth, those amps can be panned, so you can get all sorts of stereo panning effects that aren't possible with basically any vintage analog synth. It's just a one-of-a-kind synthesizer. I'm constantly amazed that this thing doesn't cost at least $3,000. And right now you can get an SQ80 for $700, which is insane. Finally, we have what I consider to be the best alternative to the PPG Wave. Coming in cleanly under $1,000, it is the Kawai K3 for $740. Pretty incredible to me that all three of these synthesizers are within $60 of each other. The Kawai K3 is an incredible synth. It has SSM filters like the Prophet 5 and the PPG Wave. So immediately it's going to have more of that SSM character the PPG Wave had than any of these other synths. And it was even called the poor man's PPG back then because one feature that this has that none of the other synths have is the ability to modulate the wavetable with aftertouch. So that lets you blend between oscillator 1 and 2, and you can actually get that sort of morphing wavetable sound with aftertouch that you can't get on any other synth from the era except for the PPG Wave. Now I get it, this synthesizer looks ugly. It's like an uglier JX8P. And people will bitch and moan about the membrane panel, but it's actually extremely fast to program. Because unlike other synths like the DW8000 where you have to enter the parameter number and then enter the value, with this you just press the membrane button and move the dial. Press the membrane button, move the dial. It's much faster to program than something like an Alpha Juno. I have always championed this synthesizer. I think it is freaking awesome. And I didn't even mention it's got a whole additive synthesizer built into it. So you can actually do additive synthesis and make your own waves. It's really crazy. It gets really deep, but it's also very easy to program. It's one of the best synths. Wonderful analog chorus. It's just, again, one of those synths I'm never going to get rid of. And for $740, if you love vintage hybrid wavetable-y type sound, or even if you love vintage digital synths like the DX7, all of those bell type tones, but you want them to have that warm analog character, I think the Kawai K3 is a great vintage synth for you. One of the most popular vintage synthesizers on Reverb is actually the Roland SH-101. So the SH-101 represents to me the 80s version of analog monosynths as opposed to something like the Minimoog or Korg MS-20, much more of like a 70s version of an analog monosynth. So even though 101s are actually very reasonable right now, you can get one for $1,250. I have a synth that I would prefer to have if I was going to buy another analog monosynth, and that is the Formanta Polyvox for $1,140. The Polyvox came out in Soviet Russia the same year as the SH-101, which was 1982. And the Polyvox is much more inspired by the ARP Odyssey and Minimoog in that it has loopable envelopes and 2 VCOs per voice, whereas the SH-101 only has 1 VCO per voice. But they both are known for their sharp, aggressive filters and how you can make incredible bass lines with them. You can also create some really soaring leads with both. I think they're both really incredible synthesizers. For me, there's nothing like the aggression you get from a Polyvox. Like if you want something that rips, something that screams, something that feels like an industrial nightmare, the Polyvox is your boy. It can actually sound really pretty too, but it is just a unique synthesizer, and it's actually pretty famous for being used more nowadays by Mick Gordon for the Doom soundtrack as well as the soundtrack for Cyberpunk 2077. These things have been going for incredible prices, and one of the things I love about these synths is it's all in Russian, so you have to get used to the Cyrillic, and you sometimes forget what a knob does, and it leads to happy accidents. The knobs are super chunky. It doesn't exactly feel well built because it's plastic, but it feels tough. You know, when you turn a knob, it like clicks into place. It's a very manly synth. Also, my Russian friend did a conversion of how expensive the synthesizer in rubles was back in the day, and he said it essentially cost half of an engineer's salary to buy this synthesizer. So a really interesting story about how the synth was made. The creator was Vladimir Kuzmin, and it's got a couple of features like the ARP Odyssey, like loopable ADSRs. It's technically duophonic, so you can put it in both modes. It's got a bandpass filter, which you don't see on those synths, but it's also got a structure that feels familiar to the Minimoog sort of thing. So it's a really unique synth. Nothing else sounds like a Polyvox. And to me, it's really one of those analog mono synths I know I'm never getting rid of. Next up, we have the best alternatives to the synthesizer that started the digital revolution, the Yamaha DX7. Now, looking around on Reverb today, I found the Yamaha V50 for $300. And this synthesizer sounds incredible. So first off, it's a 4-operator, not 6-operator FM synth. But like a lot of people know, the 4-operator synths can sound really, really good, but the V50 has the added bonus of having effects built in. So I would actually prefer to have a 4-operator synthesizer. It's a little easier to program and has built-in effects, so it sounds really great, than the super dry, plasticky, cheesy sound of the DX7. Yamaha was cranking out really high-quality synthesizers. The build quality on most of the DX synths is really good, and the V50 follows in that. I actually think this is a very underrated FM synthesizer, and if I was buying an FM synth right now, this would probably be the one I'd go for. At $300, it's a no-brainer. This could have been an Uli killer too, but I wanted to feature it here in the FM synth section. Next up, and for the first time in this video, the best alternative to the DX7 is just a DX7. The beautiful thing about synth deflation is you can now get this legendary synthesizer, the Yamaha DX7, for $550. $1,000. The thing is, they made so many DX7s in the 80s that most of them have survived. The build quality on the DX7s is like a tank, so there's no major issues with them. We live in a beautiful time. Most of the synth tones from the 80s, from those hit records are the DX7, not a legendary analog synth. And so if you love 80s music, you can get the most important 80s synthesizer for $550. I mean, how incredible is that? Next up, we have what I consider to be the best vintage FM synthesizer that you can purchase, which would be the Yamaha SY-77 for $700. Now, I have an SY-99, which is the upgraded or Mark II version of the 77 that came out in 1991. They're essentially the same synthesizer. I think the 99 has a few more waveforms and they improve the effects, but it basically sounds the same, and here is how it sounds. So the Yamaha SY series is the pinnacle of FM synthesis. And in fact, they didn't go back to 6-operator FM for about 25 years after the SY-99. The 77 came out in 89, so it's a true 80s synth, and it's essentially the same as the 99, except it's got fewer keys, and the effects engine is a little bit older. The core concept of the SY series, though, is to take 6-operator FM synthesis and combine it with the sample plus synthesis a la Roland D-50 and M1, which had come out the year before. But what you can do with these synths that you can do with no other synths until very recently is actually use those samples as operators in FM. So you can get some truly insane sounds. And like the later FM synths that Yamaha put out, you're not limited to just sine waves with your FM synth creation. You also have saw square, etc., etc. So it's this very advanced FM. You've got more algorithms than a DX7, but essentially it is a Yamaha DX7 Mark II under the hood. They don't sound identical. You can hear a patch comparison. In general, the E-piano type sounds sound virtually identical. You can actually load DX7 Mark I and II patches into an SY-77 and play it just like it was a DX7. But the tragedy of the SY-77 is that it came out too late and it came out too expensive. People had already moved on. The M1 had completely dominated the market, becoming the most popular synthesizer ever sold. And the SY-77 didn't have more memory than the M1, and it cost more. And people were kind of over the DX7 thing. It was really complicated to program. So the SY series sort of faded into obscurity, which is great for modern musicians who want to get the most super-powered FM synthesizer at $700. I mean, that's incredible that for $150 more than you can get a DX7, you can get a true powerhouse like the 77. If you want to hear more sounds and info about the SY series, I did cover my SY-99 in a live stream as well. So I've been really excited for this one. Up next, we have the best alternatives to the Roland JD-800, which is the Nostromo of the 80s digital synths. As a side note, I'd like to coin a new phrase to describe the digital synthesizers from 1987 to about 1993 or so. These turn-of-the-decade digital synths were the ones that started with the Roland D-50 with the sample plus synthesis architecture and includes synths like the Korg M1, the JD-800, the Wave Station, and the Ensoniq VFX. To me, saying vintage digital to refer to this category is a tad imprecise because there were vintage digital synths as far back as the 70s, and the most popular vintage digital synth from the 80s was the DX7, but really FM synthesis is its own category of vintage digital. So I would like to call this the ultraviolet era of vintage digital synths. There's nothing more 80s than the early 90s, and I was looking up what to call this 90s era, and it turns out there's an aesthetic called ultraviolet crush, which was used in a lot of the music videos at the time. And I thought that that was a good way to distinguish this type of synthesis, which has a very specific type of sound that really hasn't been recreated before or since then. I considered calling these grunge digital synths because the grunge genre coexisted in this exact same time frame, but of course grunge music doesn't really involve synths, so I decided to go with ultraviolet to describe this era of vintage digital synthesizer. Enough about that. What is the best budget JD-800 sound? Well, that would have to be the Korg Wave Station, which released the year prior, and you can get one of these for $480 right now. When Sequential Circuits went under, Dave Smith actually started working for Yamaha, which had a controlling stake in Korg at the time. So right at the turn of the 80s, they started taking the Prophet VS technology they'd come up with, the ability to take a joystick to blend between different partials, and they used that in the Korg Wave Station with this brand new and brilliant idea called wave sequencing. What wave sequencing is instead of using a single oscillator shape to define the sound, you can stack multiple oscillators that change over time. And the wave station can do like a crazy number of different wave shapes in a single wave sequence, like over 200 or something. And the sounds that they created with this synthesizer are unparalleled. They are the greatest presets ever. It must have been a nightmare to program. I mean, that's the thing about the wave stations is the programming is terrible. I'm not going to lie to you. The sounds, in particular, the presets from those first three banks are timeless. Or maybe timeful. I mean, they were certainly overused in the 90s. I mean, as soon as you hear Ski Jam, you're like, oh yeah, I know that one. But to me, there's something so beautiful about the sound of the wave station. And I love that Korg tried to recreate it with the wave state. And I think that's an incredible synthesizer that does use wave sequencing, but it doesn't really have the tonal characteristic of the wave station, even though they put the original samples in it. So easily the best ultraviolet era synth you can get is a wave station. It is the best presets you'll ever hear in your entire life. I love the wave station so much. It's kind of been my favorite synthesizer ever since I learned that David Wise used the wave station to compose the soundtrack for the Donkey Kong Country games for the SNES. That's the synth music I grew up listening to in the early 90s. And so that's like the nostalgia for me. I know a lot of people who watch this channel probably have more nostalgia for the 80s and even the 70s. But for me, those video game soundtracks were my introduction into really cool synth music. And the wave station was the inspiration for that. So I just love the wave station so much. And the fact that you can get one for under $500, pretty incredible. The next ultraviolet synthesizer I thought I would be talking about is the Ensoniq VFX. This synthesizer was the successor to the SQ-80 and came out in 1989. And usually they're relatively cheap and sound really good because it's sort of the digital version of an SQ80. It loses the analog resonant filter, but you gain digital effects, and it just sounds wonderful. However, the true pinnacle of Insonic's digital synthesizers, the TS series, which came out in 1993, those synths have fallen in price pretty dramatically to where they're actually cheaper than the VFX. So my next ultraviolet pick is the Insonic TS12 for $590. I have an Insonic TS10, which is the same synth architecture. It just has polyphonic aftertouch instead of 76 weighted keys. Here's how it sounds. So the Fizmo gets all the love because it's painted like a unicorn. It was expensive, flawed, and rare. But the thing about the Fizmo is it's a fundamentally broken synth. It was unfinished. You can't even access all of the parameters from the synths panel at all. Not like any other synth on this list. Like, you cannot get at some of the parameters in that synth. And so I think the true pinnacle of what Insonic was trying to do with digital synthesis is actually the TS series. It was the last synthesizers they came out with that were flagship synths before the Fizmo. You still get the polyphonic aftertouch of the SQ80 that's not in the Fizmo. You still have digital filters, which Insonic never went back to analog filters after the SQ80. But you have hyperwaves, which is Insonic's version of wave sequencing. And you've just got the best effects built into any synth ever because it's the Insonic DP4 effects built into the TS series. Those effects are legendary for a reason. The DP4 by itself tends to sell for about $1,000 at least, almost twice as much as the keyboard, which has those effects built in. So for that reason alone, it's really good. One thing I don't love about the TS series is the presets are pretty bland. I don't know why they did that. They should have really gone for it, like the Wave Station and the JD-800. I love the SQ80, but it's limited in terms of what kind of samples it has going on. You have the advantage of the analog filters, but it doesn't really sound like a D-50 or anything like that modern ultraviolet sound, right? Still very much that earlier 80s vintage digital type thing. I think the TS10 and TS12 really exemplify what I mean by ultraviolet era. And here's the link to my live stream on the TS10. Next up, we have the creme de la creme of the ultraviolet era, the Roland JD-800, which you used to not be able to get for anything less than $2,000. But now, because of synth deflation, you can get one of these incredible muscle car synthesizers for $1,650. I know it's a bit of a bait and switch again to be like, oh, the alternative to the JD-800 is just to buy a JD-800. But the thing is that this synth used to be really fucking expensive, and for whatever reason, you can now get these for sub $2,000. And the advantage of something like the JD-800 versus all of the other ultraviolet era synths is it's very programmable because you have all of those faders. It's a synth that was made to be programmed, and it's so powerful, so vast, and has such a beautiful Roland sound. The presets created by Eric Persing are gorgeous, just like any preset created by Eric Persing is going to be. I do want to caution people, most of you have probably heard about red glue, but if you haven't heard that phrase yet, what it is they put this glue in the keybed of the JD-800s and has a tendency to melt and ruin the keybed over the years. So kind of like the Poly 6, this is a little warning that when you're buying a JD-800, make sure that the seller has listed that the red glue issue has been fixed, because otherwise you could be getting a time bomb that's not repairable. But there are now many JD-800s for less than $2,000 that you can get with the red glue issue handled, and then you have a really phenomenal synthesizer. Just a joy to interact with. I know I've said it a bunch of times, but I love the ultraviolet era of digital synths. It's my favorite era of synthesizers. I love the other synths I pointed out, but this is the only ultraviolet synth that's a joy to program. Next up, we have the best CMI Fairlight or Emulator II alternatives. Basically, what do I think is the best vintage sampler for the money right now? And incredibly, we have another very expensive synthesizer that's come down in price. I was going to go with the Ensoniq Mirage because y'all know I'm an Ensoniq boy for $585, but right now you can get a Korg DSS-1 for $575 with shipping. I don't know how well you can see this DSS-1 behind me, but it is massive. It is huge. The shipping of one of these synths is so painful. So to be able to get one of these guys for that price is incredible. Like, no doubt you could spend $500 on shipping this thing alone. The DSS-1, basically everything a DW8000 is, but it also loads samples and can use those as oscillators as well. You've got that incredible NJM 2069 chip. So again, it's just the most beautiful filter sound you've ever heard. It's incredibly warm. It's got an additive synth built in as well. And one of the coolest features is you can change the bit rate of the samples in real time. So it's like a source you can modulate with the joystick. Now, of course, no one likes a big black box with the parameters printed on the side of it. They were kind enough to give you 2 parameter switches to try to make the programming a little easier, but it's a chore for sure. You also have to have the floppy disks or upgrade the floppy drive to a Gotek USB emulator or something like that, because without that, you're really going to just have a DW8000 that's a bitch to program. It's actually insane how great the DSS-1 sounds, how vast it is, how versatile, considering you can load so many sounds into it. I just think it's one of a kind. It is so feature-laden. It definitely felt like Korg, for the first time in the 80s, was really like swinging for the fences. They really wanted to make like an epic, top-of-the-line synthesizer sampler that no one else was doing. Korg's usual MO is to slide in, like scrape a couple of lesser used features off of what else is going on in the market and slide in underneath them price-wise. They're kind of almost like the original Behringer in that way. But the DSS-1 does not feel like that. The synth is a boat. It is huge, and it is packed to the brim with as many features as Korg could possibly imagine to shove into a synthesizer. Next up, we have the melting smiley face emoji synthesizer, the synthesizer that invented acid, the Roland TB-303 alternative. So the 303 is iconic. It's also very expensive. It's a small little plastic box. And in this case, I think the best alternative to a Roland 303 is the Novation Bass Station, the original one. And you can get one of those bad boys for $320 right now. This vintage synthesizer came out in 1993 and basically launched Novation as a company. One of the things I think is so awesome about the OG bass station is it bucked the trend of digital synthesis of the early 90s. Everybody else was jumping on that bandwagon, and Novation was like, you know what, we're going to put out a 303 clone that slaps. And slaps it does. It sounds really good, and for $320, you really can't argue with the value there. It's all analog, it sounds great, it does that acid thing. There's plenty of modern 303 clones that are more expensive than this and don't sound as good. It comes in both rack mount and a keyboard version, whatever you prefer. Just a really awesome vintage analog mono synth that isn't as legendary as the Bass Station 2 for some reason. It really seems like people don't even question that it says Bass Station 2. Like, no one goes like, well, what's the Bass Station 1? Next up, we have the synth that launched the ultraviolet era of digital synthesis. These are the best alternatives to the Roland D-50. Now, I love the D-50. I think I've done the most in-depth tutorial on how to program the D-50 on YouTube. But there's another synth that I kind of think is amazing, and that is the Kwai K4, which you can get right now for $475. YK4 is essentially a K1 with additional 16-bit sounds. It still retains a lot of, if not all of the 12-bit choir sounds and stuff from the K1. So it's basically got a K1 built into it, but you get a resonant digital filter and effects now. So unlike the K1, which does feel like it needs effects to be a complete synthesizer, it doesn't feel all the way there. The K4 feels like a real synthesizer. I prefer the sound of something like the K4 over the Korg M1 all day, every day. It's got that beautiful, gritty, low fidelity, glassy, industrial sound. I love Kwai. I think their synths have always had such an incredible texture to them. And the Kwai K4 is just stellar. Ambient soundscapes you can get out of this thing are not just good, they are better than sounds you can get out of the D-50 and M1 sometimes. Sure, those synths are good at what those synths do, but the K4 does its own thing, and it's freaking phenomenal. To me, the K4 is just one of the most gorgeous ultraviolet synths, and for $475, it is hard to compete with. The only thing that punches at that weight is the Wave Station at $480, but I mean, they're both just incredible synths. And of course, I've done a live stream on this bad boy too, and you can check out that up here if you want to hear and learn more about the Kwai K4. The next best D-50 alternative, and I promise this is the last time I'm going to do this, but it's the D-50. You could get a D-50 for $780 right now, which, considering it's considered one of the most legendary synthesizers of all time, I think that's amazing. When Roland released the D-50 in '87, it changed synthesis again. Now, unfortunately, the M1 came out the next year and sort of took over. It became more popular than the D-50. It was seen as an upgrade to the D-50. But in terms of sound, I think the D-50 is vastly superior to the M1. I think the M1 has some really cool, dark, low-fidelity pad sounds that really took advantage of the additional memory that synth had. But the D-50 is just iconic. It's just classic. And Roland had an advantage at the time that no other synth manufacturer had, and that is Eric Persing. He did a bunch of the patches, so did Adrian Scott. Everything those two men touch turns to gold. Staccato Heaven, Fantasia, Soundtrack, fucking Digital Native Dance. I mean, these patches are some of the best that have ever been made. You should really go check out Roland's video tribute with Eric Persing to the D-50 that came out when they released the D05, the boutique version, because you can just feel the passion coming off of Eric Persing as he goes back and checks out those patches he created for the synth, because they're just incredible. Now, I've actually done a Roland shootout on this channel with like 7 vintage synthesizers, I think, at some point. And it was in that context of shooting out that digital synthesizer against a bunch of analogs that I really realized how warm and beautiful the D-50's raw sound is. So even more so than the JD-800, which I love, the D-50 has a warmth to it that is often missing from digital synths, especially going into the 90s. You start getting these really cold, sterile, terrible tinny sounding synthesizers, even from Roland. But somehow Roland got a home run on the first pitch with the D-50. In a way, they haven't quite made a digital synth since that sounds as good as the D-50. It's just perfection. Can't fuck with it. There's some limitations. It doesn't do breathy quite as well as like the SQ80 or the Kawai synths do. It doesn't do natural instruments as well as the M1 or the Proteus does. But for those synthesizer sounds that take inspiration from organic sources but still sound distinctly synthesizer-y, if you know what I mean, the D-50 really typifies that. I just love this synth, and the fact that you can get it for $780, that's phenomenal. It's got to go on this list. We have arrived at our last legendary synthesizer, the Korg M1, the synthesizer that started the workstation and Rompler revolution. So for those of you guys who don't know, a Rompler is a kind of a made-up phrase that synth snobs have come up with to describe synthesizers that don't really have any sort of synthesis going on with the oscillators and instead just use samples, but they're not samplers because you can't sample with them. You're just using the built-in ROM sounds, which is why it's called a Rompler and not a sampler. I've separated these synthesizers away from the other ultraviolet digital synthesizers because Romplers don't really feel like entire synths. They're more more useful sound palettes. They're much better at recreating orchestral sounds and organic instruments like acoustic guitars. At the time, it was unprecedented to have pretty realistic sounds that could more or less replace an orchestra or hiring a band for the backing tracks of a song. Right around the turning point of the decade, you started hearing the soundtracks were just always composed of Rompler sounds. And so, without a doubt, the best value Rompler you can get is a Proteus 1 for $180. The EMU Proteus 1 came out in 1989 and really was the beginning of this Rompler revolution. I know I said the M1 was, but in terms of the vastness of samples, the Proteus quite outclasses the M1. Then they put out many more Proteuses that had orchestral sounds and all sorts of sounds. Another close contender would be the JV-1080, which was Roland's epic Rompler of the time, and you could get one of those for $330. But my favorite way to get that Proteus sound is actually with a Proteus MPS, or Master Performance System, so the keyboard version of the Proteus rack mount. You could get one of those bad boys for $475 right now, which is a steal. Now I have a Proteus Plus Orchestral, which is basically a Proteus 2 MPS, but here are some of the sounds that you might know from it. So the Proteus sound to me is so game-changing, and it sounds so good. I hate how the brass sounds, but the strings and the piano, they still sound gorgeous to me. I use this Rompler in my music all the time. It's so great to just pull up a sound. And the thing that's wonderful about the MPS is it's really as flexible as a Korg M1 in terms of you've got control over the filters, the amps, the envelopes, and so many built-in onboard effects that you don't get with the rack mount versions. It's also constructed really well. It's got velocity and aftertouch too. It just feels really great. I don't know why these never caught on. When I discovered the Proteus MPS, to me, that's like a legendary instrument. I love the original Mist soundtracks that Robin Miller composed, and he did that soundtrack with only a Proteus MPS Plus Orchestral. And so to me, it just immediately takes me back to that nostalgic place, kind of like I was saying with the Wave Station and Donkey Kong Country. In this case, it's those Mist sounds. They were so beautiful, and no one had heard anything like that before up until that point. It was like real orchestral music for a video game. And the Proteus MPS strikes this wonderful balance between sounding like really high fidelity, comparing it to like a K4 or even a D-50 or an M1. The Proteus is like someone lifted the roof off. It's super bright and clear, but not harsh at all. There's still like a hint of that ultraviolet digital tone in there. It's not perfect, it's not like using a modern orchestral sample library. It's still got that character to it, a little bit of an edge, an attitude, a time and a place, a certain je ne sais quoi. I know it sounds weird, but I would sell a lot of my much more expensive vintage analog polys before I'll ever sell that MPS, because it's just such a beautiful sound and I love it so much. It's great. You've got like 500 presets. You pull up whatever you want. You don't think, you just go. It's a wonderful composition tool. I find it endlessly inspiring. Finally, I'm going to sell out here for a split second, but if you want the best sounds from the Korg M1 in my opinion, which are the vintage digital pads, you can download my $10 sample pack, Revenant M1. Your guys' direct support, buying things like my sample packs from vultureculture.live, makes it possible for me to continue to make videos like this. So for everybody who's bought one of my sample packs, thank you very much. And if you want to get those really great vintage digital pads, you can check out Revenant M1. Links in the description. All right, we've come to the penultimate synthesizer on this list. I really didn't know what to call this category, but the thing is, there's no other synthesizer like the Korg Mono Poly. It is a legendary synthesizer in itself. I guess the best alternative to the Korg Mono Poly, now that I think about it, would be the Korg Poly 800, but that was way back in the beginning of this video. So I will just say that you can now get a Korg Mono Poly for $1,750, which is insane because these things were pushing $3,000 not that long ago. And here's how the Mono Poly sounds. The Mono Poly is, of course, a one-of-a-kind synth. It's a very different sort of architecture than any other synth I know. It's paraphonic. It has 4 VCOs, so in theory, you could get some pretty crazy bassline sounds. You can do hard sync. It can be different wave shapes on each of the oscillators, all detuned individually, pulse width modulation on some of them. So the raw oscillator shape can be pretty complex. It's also got a wonderful arpeggiator, the same one from the Korg Poly 6, and that in combination with the LFO on the sawtooth wave can create some really interesting polyrhythmic stuff. People love the experimental nature of the Mono Poly. Korg was definitely trying to come up with something a little different, and no one's really done a synth like the Mono Poly since. It's funny because it doesn't necessarily scream out to me as being the best at anything. When I think of leads, it wouldn't be my first go-to. When I think of basses, it wouldn't be my first go-to. Maybe arpeggiation's where it stands out because it cycles through those different waveforms, which is really neat. Each waveform can be at different ranges, so you can get these really interesting different arpeggios than were possible with any other synthesizer at the time. But I think the Mono Poly really exemplifies that statement, the sum is greater than the parts. For whatever reason, the Mono Poly's different ingredients come together to create a sound truly its own. The VCOs go out of tune constantly, and that's kind of fun. You're always chasing the tune on them. It's a very analog, very warm, very characterful, very unique synth. I mean, that's really all I have to say about it. If you know what the Mono Poly is, you already know that. So finally, we have come to my desert island vintage synthesizer. I get this question quite a bit. If you had to sell everything, I mean everything but one synthesizer, which one would it be? And yes, this synthesizer is the only synth on this list that costs more than $2,000, and it is the Fender Chroma Polaris, which you can get right now for $2,400. So to answer why this synth is so important to me, we have to look at the Prophet 600 right below it there. The thing about the Prophet 600 is, it is by far the cheapest 2 VCO vintage analog synth you can get. However, I got a couple of qualms with it. First off, many people have noted that the sound is very bright. It's not thin sounding, it's actually just bright. That filter goes really high up, and it doesn't necessarily sound that vintage because of it. Whereas the Polaris has a more constrained filter that gives it that warm, brassy tone. The other thing is, the Prophet 600 is the only synthesizer I've ever experienced where the envelopes bother me. Even with the Glee Glee mod, they don't seem 100% right. I don't know what it is, they just bother me. It's like I never seem to be able to get them right. I don't know if it's the digital control, there's just not enough resolution or something. So for me, personally, I think anybody should be happy with the Prophet 600, but it's got a couple of things that bother me. So I have to go to the next cheapest 2 VCO per voice analog poly, and that's actually the Fender Chroma Polaris. The Polaris is fascinating because it's essentially an ARP instrument. Tony Williams was a designer for ARP that did a lot of the early work on the Polaris, getting it going, after the company had gone under and it had been bought by CBS Fender. And so it's the only synthesizer ever to have Fender, the guitar brand, branded on it. Now, it's quirky. It's got a few things at first glance which would make you think it's inferior to the Prophet 600. For one thing, it doesn't have a mixer, so if you want to turn off an oscillator, you just have to move the pulse width through 0. You don't have variable control over the velocity for the filter. It's either on or off. Same thing with the amplifier. If you have the velocity on the filter and the amplifier, it's like way too much. You don't have any control over the mix of the noise going into the filter. So you just turn it on or off, and in my opinion, it's too much. But the reason I'm never getting rid of the Polaris is because of the sound. And I hate to be that way. I really like to talk objectively about synthesizers and talk about the features they have. Ultimately, I think most of the time what sounds good about a synth is the way it's used, how much modulation potential it has, and not always so much the raw oscillators and filter. Damn, they got it right in the Polaris, for me. I know not everybody loves the sound. Some people think of the Polaris as being in that cold analog category, but to me, this thing, it's just so lush. So let's talk about that. Here's a few things that contribute to the lushness. The first thing is that you can do saw width mod on the sawtooth waves, and it again doesn't sound like saw width mod on the X60 or the Alpha Juno. It's kind of its own sound. I would say it's the one that sounds the closest to true pulse width modulation. It's just got a really great movement to the sawtooth wave without it really feeling like you've lost the sound of the sawtooth wave. It doesn't sound like a Hoover. The ring modulator is awesome. So unlike the ring modulator on the Yamaha CS series, which is independent pitch, this is relative pitch. So this is like, you can just get some crazy distorted sounds that are very similar to the ARP Odyssey, which I did have in this studio for like one day. The filter just sounds amazing. It's actually the same filter in the Matrix 12, which is the Curtis 3372 filter chip. They actually share the same oscillators, the 3374 dual oscillator chip as well. But it's just so mid-rangey. It's got so much push to it, and it doesn't ever get harsh. It always sounds fat, but in this very specific way. It doesn't get dark the way Korg synths can. It's just always in your face. Then we can push that filter into the most beautiful self-resonance that can be key tracked perfectly. So you get these beautiful filter oscillation bell sounds, just hypnotizing. And then that amplifier is running so hot that if you're pushing like more than 50%, it's distorting. So I think that's a big part of why I like the sound, is that synth is like just constantly ripping guitar amp levels of distortion. Going back to the oscillators, the LFOs are polyphonic. So when you have pulse width modulation going to the sawtooth or the square waves, what you end up getting is beautiful breakup of the oscillator sound. So unlike most synths where the PWM, they're all synced together, on this, you get this drift between all of them, which is insanely lush. And then the real piece de resistance is the oscillator detune. So unlike on most synths where the bipolar nature of oscillator detune is to either tune positively or negatively, right? On this synth, if you tune the oscillator detune up, it detunes oscillator 2 just like on a regular synth. If you detune it down, it key tracks the detune. You've never really thought about what that means in terms of the potential. When you think of oscillator detune, when you play one note, there's going to be a beating of the oscillators. And if you go up an octave, that beating is going to be twice as fast. And if you go down an octave, it's going to be half as fast, right? Well, when you key track the detune, it's always the same speed. So what that ends up sounding like is much more like a chorus on a Juno as opposed to actual detune, because when you play different notes, the detune is still in phase. I don't know of any synth that can do that. It is unrelentingly pretty sounding. So all of those little quirky things, there's a lot about the synth that's not optimal. It was very smartly laid out, very smartly designed by Tony Williams. It has that ARP sound baked into it. I've never played a Rhodes Chroma, the synthesizer that it's derived from, but for me, the Polaris is perfection. That's my desert island synth. So those are what I think are the best vintage synthesizers to buy in 2024, but I want to know what you guys think. Did I miss your favorite synthesizer? Do you think I got it right? Did I get it completely wrong? Please let me know what you guys think down in the comments. I go through the comments and I read all of them. I try to respond to as many as I can. I've really gotten to know a lot of you guys through the comment section, which I really appreciate. I just want you guys to know that I'm really interactive in the comments. So please do leave a comment. It helps me with that fucking algorithm. If you like this video, this should be another video you will enjoy. Continue to be excellent, guys, and I will see you there.